Welcome to Face the State. I'm Arianna Bennett. Thank you for joining us. If you see blue pinwheels set up around the state this month, it's meant to bring awareness to child abuse prevention. But when we can't prevent it and the worst cases happen, they end up with my guest for this show. Washoe County District Attorney Chris Hicks is here with me to talk about that. Chris, thank you so much for coming back on the show.
Pleasure to be here.
Great to have you as always. Now, April is Child Abuse Prevention Month, so kind of a good opportunity to talk about our body of laws and how well they're protecting children in our community. So we'll start with that. How well are we doing, do you think?
Well, I think we're doing great in our community. And that's in large part because of our Child Advocacy Center, which the DA's office started about 10 years ago. And it really revolutionized the way that child abuse, child sexual abuse, and physical abuse cases were investigated and prosecuted in Washoe County. So without a doubt, we have seen a tremendous improvement over the last 10 years, some great outcomes, some great results in court, and some really incredible service for those young victims. But we don't catch everybody all the time, and it's definitely going on in the community.
Do you think it's getting worse, or have we seen kind of a steady stream of cases like this?
It's tough to gauge. I would say when we first opened the Child Advocacy Center, I was frankly shocked at the amount of cases, primarily sexual abuse cases, that were coming through there. And it was kind of like a Field of Dreams, the movie, if you will, or Build It and They Will Come. We saw just a tremendous amount of cases. But because of the way we investigate the cases there, that multidisciplinary approach with less trauma on the child, embracing them in every way, offering counseling, having medical at the facility, it just immensely improved the cases. And so the amount of sexual predators that we have removed from our streets who are now serving life sentences in the Nevada Department of Corrections is immense. So I know for a fact that that has improved the community immensely, but they still come up.
Yeah.
We had a sentencing just yesterday of an individual who was sentenced to 4 life sentences with parole eligibility after 98 years, but what he had done was horrific. He was peddling child pornography, he was actually producing it, and the victim was just 4 to 6 years old. It's the kind of stuff that tears your heart apart. You don't want to believe that that's going on in our community, but the good news is we go very aggressively at those individuals, and we're doing a good job with it.
Yeah, and speaking of cases that tear your heart apart, recently we've had this case that's been in the public eye. People are really invested and passionate about it. The case of Isabella Loving, a 5-year-old girl beaten to death. Her father is the suspect in the case, and we've gotten a lot of curiosity from the public about how this case is going to be prosecuted. And obviously, I know you can't speak to specific cases, but cases like this, what's the process? What happens behind the scenes?
Well, I would first say, as to this case, I can't comment on it, but I understand the community concerns, and they exist with me as well. But in these kinds of cases, we take a very measured approach because we want to make sure that we have all the available evidence we can have. Because when we do make that decision to charge somebody, the clock starts ticking of everything that comes into play with that. And we always want to make sure that we're have good footing to move forward, so we'll get justice for that victim and get the appropriate outcome. In your typical child abuse case, it customarily goes through our Child Advocacy Center, which I mentioned a minute ago. In a case that involves a homicide, that is another specialized team I have in my office. And in that capacity, we also do multidisciplinary investigations. We start with law enforcement very soon after the crime had occurred. And we work it with them from interviews to collection of evidence to staffings to making sure, like I said, that we have the best product so we can push forward a successful case to be sure to get justice for that victim and to improve our community safety.
I mean, I know what this is like from a news perspective, trying to remain objective and report on stories that are they just gut you. because we're all human beings at the end of the day. For you, having to look at cases like this, is that a difficulty, kind of removing emotion from it, or is it helpful to keep the emotion in?
Well, the emotion is motivating. It always has been for me. I've been lucky enough to be a prosecutor in the community that raised me for over 20 years. And since day one, I was motivated by helping my community and motivated by helping victims. And yes, we see some awful things, just like our law enforcement partners do on the streets. But that adds to the feeling you get when you have success and know you've done a good job. And so it's tough, but I love it.
Yeah, it's actionable. You can maybe do something good after the fact. Okay, so part of this case, and I think with many others, we see charges come down when suspects are identified. Those charges might not always initially match what the crime they're suspected of. Can you explain what that process is like, why we don't always see the full slate of charges right away?
Absolutely. So, to your point a minute ago about the Loving case, I totally understand how the community wants to see action. And like I said, so do I. But you don't want your prosecutor making rash decisions because we only get one chance to take a case through the criminal justice system. That's it. And we, like I said a minute ago, we want to make sure we're on sound footing when we do so. So what we do in my office in a general sense, when a case is submitted, we do our own independent review. Now, the law enforcement agencies do their investigations. They're an investigative agency. We're a prosecutorial agency. And then they submit it to our office for prosecution once they believe there's sufficient evidence. We do our own independent review, weighing it against the standard we have, which is the highest in the criminal, or highest in the legal system, beyond a reasonable doubt. So we have to make sure that there's admissible, credible evidence that supports a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. And when that is so, we file the appropriate charges. When it's not, sometimes cases don't meet that mark when they're submitted to our office. And at those times, we'll decline that case, ask law enforcement to do some additional work, and then resubmit it so that we can make sure, again, to get the appropriate justice. That's in a general sense. Now, in cases of higher magnitude, perhaps a child sexual assault or a homicide case, there's so much evidence that is collected. There's so many different avenues that are pursued in the investigation. So sometimes you may, in fact, see certain charges occur, but that might not be the end game. It might be, it might not be, but there is a continual analysis where my prosecutors are working with the detectives, working with forensics, hearing from medical examiner's office on what their findings are. There's a lot going on before we can make those final determinations.
And sometimes we see charges added on after the fact, right? Later on down the line, as soon as you have enough evidence to add those charges?
Absolutely. Sometimes we may add charges. Sometimes you'll see law enforcement might make an arrest of somebody and they might arrest them for multiple charges. But when we do our independent review, look at all the evidence and make a formal charging decision, sometimes there are different charges. Sometimes there's less, sometimes there's more. And that's because we're evaluating it from what's now going to be the process through the courts, ultimately sentencing, and ultimately justice served.
Okay. So then we get through the process, we have charges filed, and then there's kind of like this whole how the sausage gets made piece of justice where we get to a point where maybe there's a plea bargain, maybe there's some deals being made between your office and the defense attorney. How do you decide when a plea bargain is on the table?
Well, so we have a formalized document in the DA's office that is called our Charging and Plea Bargaining Standards. And that is a tool, guidelines for my prosecutors in their decision-making process. The first process is the one I just kind of talked about, the charging decision. We have to make sure that there's sufficient evidence to move forward. And when there is, which is about 90% of the time of the cases we get submitted from law enforcement, then we make our charging decision. Then we move to negotiations, because as everybody knows, it's a necessary component of the legal system. It happens very often. However, we don't offer undue leniency in our plea negotiations. And what I mean by that is we have plea bargaining standards as well. And the general principle that overall those guidelines I talked about speaks for is we're not going to make that critical decision to charge somebody with a crime. That's a big deal, unless we know we can prove it or have a reasonable belief that we can prove it. But once we get to that stage, we're going to ask the defendant if they want to, get some kind of plea negotiation, they have to accept responsibility for what they did. They have to plead to the primary charge that they committed. And if they're willing to do that, and if they're willing to exercise some personal responsibility and say, look, I screwed up, but I want to move forward, what kind of opportunities can I give? Then we'll look at it closely. When it comes to plea bargaining, we evaluate every case on an individualized, in an individualized manner, the facts and circumstances of each case, because everyone's a little different. If someone has a vast criminal history, or it's a very serious crime, their outcome might be prison. But if it's somebody who maybe lost their way a little bit, nobody was hurt really badly, something like that, well, they might get probation or diversion court. But we strike that balance every day. And we strive so hard for that because we want the community to know. We want the community to trust that when the Washoe County DA's office, at least as long as I'm there, is charging a case, they have a reasonable belief in the evidence that they're going to be able to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And when they're negotiating a case, they're holding the person who committed that crime accountable. And we're doing that for the trust of the community, for the victims of those crimes, and for public safety.
And the, I guess, advantage to a plea agreement is that the victim then doesn't have to face the criminal in court, and saves taxpayer money, saves court time, that sort of thing. This is why we have this to begin with.
Absolutely. I mean, we look at negotiations and plea negotiations as a benefit to the system. It's not, sometimes it gets portrayed as, oh, they're giving away a case, and that is the case in some parts of our country and some counties. But the way we see it is, look, if you're going to come in and accept responsibility for what you did, we're going to incentivize that and accept that as somebody who's might deserve some kind of break. It doesn't always work that way because, like I said, some people have just done enough bad things that they don't deserve a break.
And sometimes judges won't accept it either.
Yeah, it's pretty rare that a judge doesn't accept what we've done, and I think that's because of our accountability standards. It frankly is a common sense way to prosecute. And it seems to be working. A vast amount of our cases, people plead guilty, and they're pleading in our most serious cases. They're pleading to the charge they committed, so it's working. They're being held accountable. They're taking personal responsibility, and then we decide, along with defense counsel or arguments to the judge, what the best sentence is.
Okay, well, that's a good opportunity for us to take a quick break. But coming up on Face This Date, I will be back with Washoe County District Attorney Chris Hicks to talk about some of his department's new initiatives. Stay with us.